Inside Unit 731, Japan's secret World War II human experiment lab, the horror. You were never meant to know. There are stories the world would rather forget. Stories buried beneath official records, erased from textbooks, whispered only in the darkest corners of history. One such story is that of Unit 731, Japan's most chilling wartime secret. This wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't an open war. It was something far worse. Behind locked gates and frozen walls, men and women in white coats transformed science into a weapon, not against soldiers, but against the innocent. Civilians, prisoners, children. Here, the rules of humanity did not exist. Every scream was muffled by snow. Every secret was buried in the permafrost. And every discovery was written in blood. Seeds of darkness. The Empire's hidden plan. It began quietly. In the early 1930s, Japan was expanding its empire, conquering new lands, and dreaming of domination. But military strength alone was not enough. The empire sought a darker kind of power, biological weapons. The seeds of Unit 731 were planted by a man named Shi Ishii, a brilliant doctor with a mind twisted by ambition. Ishii was no ordinary physician. He believed science should serve the empire at any cost, even if that meant turning human beings into test subjects. To him, men, women, and children were not lives. They were data. They were numbers. They were tools. Japan approved his vision. With government blessing, Ishii was given funds, soldiers, and secrecy. And so, in the frozen lands of Manchuria, far from Tokyo, the first foundations of Unit 731 were laid. The Fortress of Shadows in Harbin, the chosen site, was Harbin, a city in occupied Manchuria. At first glance, it was just another military compound. Tall walls, guarded gates, watchtowers piercing the sky. But what lay inside was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Unit 731 stretched across more than 6 square kilometers. It was a city within a city. Barracks, laboratories, prisons, crematoriums, and underground tunnels. At its heart stood the fortress-like main laboratory, a building where screams echoed through sterile halls and where death wore the disguise of science. To outsiders, it was called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. A harmless name, a clever mask. But inside those walls, prisoners called it something else. They called it hell. Voices that were silenced forever. The victims came from all walks of life. Chinese peasants accused of being rebels, Korean prisoners, Russian captives, criminals. Sometimes even children were dragged in, their small hands clutching their mother's clothes, their eyes wide with fear. To the guards and doctors, they weren't people. They were labeled as logs. A word meant to strip them of humanity. A word that reduced flesh and blood to an object, a disposable piece of wood. Every prisoner knew, once you entered Unit 731, you never left alive. The walls were high, the guards merciless, and the air heavy with despair. Families were ripped apart, names were erased. What remained were only screams and then silence. When science became a weapon of terror inside the laboratories, experiments began. They were not for healing. They were not for progress. They were for war. Victims were strapped to tables, their bodies cut open without anesthesia, as doctors observed the slow dance of death. Organs were removed, veins examined, wounds inflicted, not for survival, but to record how long a body could last. Some were deliberately infected with deadly diseases: anthrax, cholera, typhoid, plague. Others were burned, starved, or deprived of oxygen just to see how much the human body could endure before breaking. Every note, every chart, every drawing was considered data, and every cry for mercy was ignored. Frozen limbs, burning flesh, nature as a torture chamber. The winters of Manchuria are brutal. Temperatures drop so low that frostbite can kill within minutes. To the scientists of Unit 731, this was an opportunity. Prisoners were taken outside, stripped of their clothes, and forced to stand in the icy wind. Buckets of water were poured over their arms and legs until the skin froze solid. Doctors would then strike the frozen limbs with sticks until the sound of ice cracking filled the air. Sometimes the flesh was thawed and frozen again, over and over, until it blackened and rotted. Other times, the victims were placed directly into boiling water, their bodies convulsing at the purpose to study frostbite. But the true result was suffering beyond imagination. Manufacturing death. The human plague experiments, Unit 731's deadliest project, was its work with disease. The doctors didn't just study germs, they weaponized them. Prisoners were deliberately infected with bubonic plague, smallpox, and syphilis. Fleas carrying plague were bred in massive numbers, then released into Chinese villages, turning entire communities into laboratories of death. Planes sprayed bacteria over fields and rivers. Wells were poisoned. Crops were contaminated. What began in Harbin spread across China like wildfire, leaving thousands of civilians writhing in agony. For the empire, this was science. For the victims, it was apocalypse. Smiling faces, unspeakable crimes. The men who carried out these horrors didn't see themselves as monsters. Many of them smiled. They were educated doctors, researchers, family men. They ate dinner with their families after a day of cutting open prisoners. Some even believed they were serving a higher purpose, that sacrificing logs for data would one day save Japanese soldiers' lives. Others simply enjoyed the power, the thrill of deciding who lived and who died. What made Unit 731 so terrifying wasn't just the cruelty of its experiments. It was the banality of it. Ordinary men in white coats committing extraordinary evil. Echoes that history tried to bury when victims screamed. Their voices never traveled beyond the walls. The snow absorbed the sound, and the guards silenced anyone who dared to resist. Those who perished were burned in secret crematoriums, their ashes scattered in fields. But silence cannot erase memory. Whispers of experiments, of plague bombs, of children used as test subjects. Their words would one day surface, echoing across decades, refusing to be buried. History tried to forget, but history failed. When the monster feared exposure as World War II turned against Japan, fear spread inside Unit 731. The empire was crumbling. Soviet forces were advancing. And suddenly, the fortress of shadows was no longer safe. Orders were given. Destroy everything. Kill the prisoners. Leave no trace of what had been done. Guards executed captives en masse. Labs were set on fire. The walls that once echoed with screams now roared with the sound of destruction. The empire wanted the world to never know. Erasing blood with lies and ashes. When the Soviets arrived, they found ruins, charred remains, empty cells, a silence that screamed of hidden crimes. But some evidence remained. Bones buried in shallow pits, testimonies from survivors, and whispers among the soldiers who once served Ishii. Yet, instead of punishment, something darker happened. The United States, eager to gain an advantage in biological warfare, struck a secret deal with Sure Ishii and his men. Immunity in exchange for data. Freedom in exchange for horror. The men of Unit 731 walked free, carrying their crimes like shadows, while the victims were left with silence. The legacy of darkness that haunts us still. Unit 731 was not just a story of the past. Its shadow lingers. The data collected in Harbin influenced biological research long after the war. Survivors lived with scars the world rarely acknowledged. Families mourned in silence, their grief unspoken. Even today, debates rage over how much of the truth remains hidden. How much was destroyed? How much was covered up? And whether justice was ever truly served. The legacy of Unit 731 is not just about death. It is about the danger of unchecked power, the corruption of science, and the ease with which humanity can be erased when people are reduced to numbers. It is a shadow that reminds us the monsters we fear most are not always in the dark. Sometimes they wear white coats. Sometimes they smile